The town of Hollow Creek nestled quietly among rolling green hills, a place where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. Narrow cobblestone streets wound through rows of rustic wooden houses, past small, aging storefronts where faded signs swayed lazily in the breeze. Life here was steady, predictable, like a painting untouched by time. That afternoon was no different. The townspeople went about their usual routines. A handful of locals sat outside the rusty mug, sipping warm tea, exchanging idle chatter. Old men read their newspapers in the shade. Children ran barefoot along the sidewalks, their laughter echoing in the warm air. At the market stand, women sorted through fresh produce, trading gossip in hushed voices. Everything was just as it had always been. Until that sound. A low, faint at first, then stronger. Louder like a storm rolling in. Every head turned toward the main road. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps slowed. The peaceful rhythm of Hollow Creek was about to be shattered. They came roaring in. A gang of bikers, tearing through the heart of town like a pack of wolves. At the head of the pack was a broad-shouldered man, wild hair tousled by the wind, a thick beard shadowing his hardened face. Axel Reaper Voffen. The name meant nothing to the townspeople, but his kind. They recognized his kind instantly. A drifter. A man who lived outside the law. A man who didn't need to raise his voice to demand attention. His presence did that for him. His black Harley Davidson glided over the asphalt, chrome glinting under the late afternoon sun. He looked like a gunslinger from an old Western film. A lawless spirit with nowhere to be and no one to answer to. Behind him, nearly a dozen men followed. Their engines snarled like caged beasts, shaking the air, filling the quiet town with something it had never known before. A sense of unease. The reactions were immediate. A shopkeeper near the fruit stand instinctively stepped back inside, pretending to rearrange the shelves. An elderly woman, stacking apples into wooden crates, fumbled with trembling hands. A father walking with his young daughter subtly guided her behind him. This town was too small, too quiet, too untouched by the world for men like these. But now that peace had been invaded, the motorcycles rumbled down the street, past storefronts and homes, tires grinding against the pavement, leather-clad figures scanning the sidewalks through dark sunglasses. Then, Axel eased off the throttle. His eyes swept the town from behind the cover of his shades. He wasn't just passing through. He was looking for something. And then he saw it, a small cafe on the corner of the street. The Rusty Mug, a quiet place. A perfect place to stop. With a sharp jerk of the handlevers, Axel Reaper Voffen swerved onto the sidewalk in front of the cafe. The tires screeched against the stone pavement, a sharp, grating sound that cut through the quiet afternoon like a blade. One by one, the rest of the motorcycles followed. Engines died. The gang had arrived, settling like they had just claimed the place as their own. Inside the Rusty Mug, conversation stopped. A barista behind the counter, mid-pour with a steaming teapot, froze. His hands hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. A few customers lifted their cups, pretending to sip, but no one drank. Their gazes were locked onto the front glass. Axel pulled off his sunglasses, scanning the cafe, like a predator surveying its prey. He inhaled deeply, then smirked. Looks like a fun little place, he muttered, stepping off his bike. His heavy boots hit the ground. A dull weighted thud against the thickening tension. One by one, his men dismounted. Some leaned lazily against their bikes. Others strode toward the cafe, pushing at invisible boundaries with nothing but their presence. No one spoke, but everyone knew. The peace had been disturbed. Inside, a man sat quietly by the window, watching everything unfold. Tuck lifted his cup, took a slow sip. Jason Steele. No one noticed him. Not yet, but that would soon change, because the real storm hadn't even started. Axel walked slowly along the sidewalk, his boots clicking steadily against the stone. His gang spread out behind him, some perched on their motorcycles, others leaned against the walls, their eyes sweeping over the cafe's customers like wolves circling a herd. They hadn't done anything yet, but their presence alone was enough to thicken the air with tension. Axel wasn't in a hurry. He liked this part, the stolen glances, the stiffened shooters, the quiet fear. This was why he rode into towns like this. Not for the bear, not for the food, but for the feeling of owning the space. His gaze roamed across the scene, absorbing every reaction, until his eyes landed on the cafe steps. And there, right in his path, two dogs. A golden retriever, its golden for catching the sunlight, unbothered. Beside it, a Doberman, sleek black coat stretched over solid muscle, its stance rigid like a soldier at attention. Axel narrowed his eyes. He didn't hate dogs, didn't care much about them either. But right now, they interested him. Not because he liked them, because he wanted to see how the town would react if he messed with something that belonged to them. He nudged one of his men with his elbow, nodding toward the dogs. Look at these two, living the good life. His voice dripped with sarcasm. I bet they eat better than we do. The gang chuckled. Some nodded, others smirked, waiting curious, waiting to see what Axel would do next. Axel took a step forward. The golden retriever didn't move, just sat there, deep brown eyes watching him. Calm, unafraid. Axel smirked. Well, aren't you comfortable? He reached out, hand hovering just above Myler's head. The dog tilted its head slightly, not pulling away, just watching. Then Axel lifted his boot and kicked the retriever's side, not enough to hurt, just enough to make Milo flinch. The dog stepped back, just confused, like it didn't understand why. And that was the moment everything changed. Fast lunging, not growling, just standing. But suddenly his frame seemed twice as big. Tension rippled through his muscles. His eyes, sharp, dark, unwavering, locked onto Axel, not moving a sourword, but making it clear. One more step, and he would. The cafe fell silent. The Ganga's laughter died. A few of them shifted, exchanging glances. Something was off. Inside, a waitress dropped a tray. Glass shattered against tile. An old man folded his newspaper tighter, fingers gripping the edges. A little boy, halfway through licking his ice cream, stopped, because even at that age, he felt it. The shift, the storm was here, and it was just about to break. The boy standing nearby froze, his ice cream slowly melting, dripping onto the ground. But no one noticed. No one moved. No one spoke, because every single person there understood. A line had just been crossed. Axel hesitated for a split second when he saw the Doberman react. But then, he smirked. He turned to his men, tilting his head toward the dog. Look at that. Guess it wants to play hero. The gang chuckled again, but this time, it was forced. The laughter didn't carry the same confidence. A few still grinned, but their eyes, they were watching closely. Axel shrugged, turning back to the dogs. Relax. It was just a little tap. What's the matter? Too soft to handle it? Still, no one inside the cafe spoke. Not a single word. And a sound. Not a yell. No. Not a slammed fist. Just a soft, quiet clink. The sound of a teacup being set back onto its saucer. Axel felt it before he saw it. Something had changed. Not within his gang. Not with the stunned townspeople around him. Something turned. And that's when he saw him. A man stood up from a table inside the cafe. Jason Steele. No one breathed. Every gaze locked onto him. Jason wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. He simply stepped forward, his eyes passing over Axel, before settling on the two dogs. The golden retriever had taken a small step back, but there was no fear in its eyes, was waiting. The Doberman. It was no longer looking at Axel. Its gaze was locked onto Jason, like it was awaiting a signal. Jason didn't speak. Not yet. He just stood there. Still, his presence alone was enough to make Axel shift uncomfortably. For the first time in his life, Axel felt like the weaker man. The entire town held its breath, because whatever happened next, it was something Axel would never forget. Axel blinked. He wasn't sure why, but at that moment, something crawled under his skin. Not fear. Not anger, just something unfamiliar. He had faced plenty of men before. Seen rage, even hatred. But never had he felt this. Never had he felt like he was no longer the center of attention. Jason Steele rose from his seat. Not fought slow. Not a single wasted movement. He simply stood, placed his teacup down, and stepped out of the cafe. No one spoke. No one dared to breathe, because with nothing more than a simple action, Jason had just shifted the entire room. Axel swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. His eyes ran over Jason, searching for something. A tell, a hint of anger. Something he could read. But Jason gave him nothing. Jason wasn't in a rush. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, stood tall, hands relaxed at his sides. Not aggressive, not passive there. And somehow, that was enough to make the air feel heavy. Axel forced a smirk. Tried to look unfazed. What's your problem, buddy? And your dogs are fine. Jason didn't answer right away. Instead crouched down, resting a hand gently on Myler's head. The golden retriever pressed into his touch. Trusting, Titan standing beside him, seemed to relax ever so slightly. But his eyes, they never left Axel. Jason straightened. Finally met Axel's gaze, and then, in a voice calm and steady, yet heavier than any shouted threat, he asked, "What did you just do?" Axel cleared his throat, forcing himself to stay in control. "I told you, man, it was just a joke." Jason didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a single step toward Axel. Just one step. But Axel unconsciously stepped back. The bikers behind him noticed immediately. A few exchanged glances. Some just stared, waiting for their leader's next move. Axel clenched his jaw. He couldn't let this continue. Taking a deep breath, he crossed arms, forcing a smirk. Come on, you're blowing this way out of proportion. Buddy, we were just having a little fun. If it upset you, fine. I will apologize. But Jason tilted his head slightly. His expression didn't change. A bead of sweat formed at the back of Axel's neck. Jason stepped forward again. This time, Axel didn't step back. But he felt it, felt the shift. Felt that, no matter what he did next, he wasn't in control anymore. Jason didn't yell. Didn't posture. Didn't threaten. And somehow, that made him even more terrifying. For the first time in his life, Axel realized he was facing a man he couldn't intimidate. The entire town held its breath, because whatever happened next would teach Axel a lesson he would never forget. Axel squared his shoulders, forcing the tension out of his stance. There was no way he'd step back from a guy who had just walked out of a cafe. No way he was losing ground. He was Axel Reaper, Vaughan. He feared no one, and he sure as hell wasn't about to let his own crew see him back down. Axel scoffed, adjusting the collar of his leather jacket. Then, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "So what now, huh?" His voice was low, sharp. "You wanna fight me? Over a damn dog?" Jason still didn't answer. He just stood there, watching, evaluating, like Axel wasn't even worth the effort. And that what pushed Axel over the edge. Axel bared his teeth, jabbing a finger at Jason's chest. "Who the hell do you think you are? You think you can just stand there and make me afraid?" Jason exhaled softly, shook his head. He knew his gaze met Axel's. "I don't have to know, that was it. That was all it took." Axel snapped. His fist shot forward, aimed straight at Jason's face. Fast. Brutal. A punch designed to put a man down. But Jason didn't move. Not the way Axel expected. Instead, he stepped aside. A single, precise movement. Effortless. And as Axel's momentum carried him forward, Jason's hand shot out, catching his wrist. In the span of a heartbeat, Axel felt his own weight being used against him. Before he could even process what was happening, Jason pivoted, a simple shift of balance, and suddenly Axe was airborne. For one fleeting second it felt the weightlessness, the loss of control. Then, he slammed into the ground. Dust kicked deep. The impact rattled through his body. For a brief moment, everything was still. The bikers behind him, mouths hung open, frozen. No one who spoke. No one had expected that. Axel grinned, pushing himself up. His mind raced. He stared at Jason, eyes wide with disbelief. What the hell just happened? Had he just been taken down? That easily? Jason still stood there, unshaken. No arrogance. No smugness. Just calm. Axel was furious. He couldn't let in like this. With a roar, he charged at Jason again. But Jason didn't need to dodge. He stepped aside, smooth, effortless, redirecting Axel's momentum, letting him defeat himself. Axel couldn't stop in time. His balance broke. And this time, he collapsed onto both knees. Not a single biker dared to speak. Silence stretched through the street. Axel scrambled to his feet, rage burning through him. But he didn't charge again. Because now, he understood. Jason wasn't some street brawler. He didn't fight with fists alone. He fought with skill. And that was the deadliest difference between them. Axel's breath came hard and fast. Sweat beaded at his brow. But Jason was still there. Calm, unshaken, like a statue carved from stone. This can still end here, Jason said, his voice steady. You don't have to keep going. Axel gritted his teeth. He wanted to keep going. He needed to take back control. But deep down, he knew. If he attacked again, the result wouldn't change. Behind him, his crew was beginning to realize it too. A biker cleared his throat, hesitated, then stepped forward. Hey Axel, maybe we should stop. Axel spun on him, eyes blazing. He shut up, but the biker instantly shut his mouth. But the hesitation in his eyes was clear. And it wasn't just him. The others were starting to look at each other. They were questioning if Axel was really as strong as they thought. And in that moment, Axel knew he had lost, not just the fight, but the respect of the men who followed him. He lowered his gaze, took a slow, heavy breath, then looked at Jason. Jason still didn't look triumphant, still didn't look like a man reveling in victory. He just stood there, as if none of this had ever been a big deal to him. Axel inhaled sharply, swallowed what was left of his pride. Then, he took a step back. We're leaving. No one argued. One by one, the bikes were lifted upright. One by one, the engines rumbled back to life. But this time, they didn't sound the same. There was no swagger. No confidence. Just a quiet retreat. Jason said nothing else. He simply crouched down, running hand gently over Milo's head. The golden retriever wagged its tail, like it knew the danger had passed. The townspeople didn't dare to breathe too loudly. They only watched as the gang that had stormed into their quiet home now disappeared down the road. Axel didn't look back, but he knew he would never forget this day, and neither would his men, because now they knew they had messed with the wrong man. Axel stood there, breath ragged, his chest rising and falling with barely contained frustration. His mind raced. He had never imagined a day like this. A day where he would be taken down so easily. A day where would be humiliated in front of his own crew. But the worst part, it wasn't that he lost. It was how he lost. Jason Steele never used excessive force. No crushing punches. No devastating kicks. No one was left groaning in pain on the ground. All he did was use Axel's own strength against him. And that was what made this defeat so much worse. The biker gang stood frozen. No one mocked. They could not. Because now, they had seen something they had never witnessed before. A man who didn't need to threaten, didn't need to act tough, yet still controlled everything. Jason took a step toward Axel. Not fast, not slow, not in a way that screamed danger, but each step cut deeper to Axel's pride than any punch ever could. Axel instinctively stepped back, just half a step. But it was enough. Jason stopped, looked him straight in the eye. You kicked my dog. His voice was calm, steady. No mockery, just a fact. And somehow, that fact sent a chill down Excel's spine. Jason tilted his head slightly. His expression didn't change. You know what that feels like. Axel clenched his fists. But this time, he didn't swing. He understood. He understood that if he did, the result would be exactly the same. Jason Steele wasn't just some brute relying on muscle or aggression. He was something much worse for a man like Axel. A fighter who knew his own strength, who knew how to stay in control, who knew exactly when to strike, and when he didn't even need to. Axel realized that while he had spent his whole life making others fear him, Jason only had to stand there to make Axel feel something he had never felt before. Uncertainty. Axel swallowed hard, his fists slowly loosened. He lowered them. Jason gave a small nod, like he could see it, that Axel had finally understood. Then he turned his back and walked away, not looking back, not needing, because this had never been a fight. It had been a lesson Axel would never forget. Axel, Reaper Vaughn, stood there, breathing hard, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the strongest man in the room. He had tried to dominate Jason with threats, with fists, with the same aggression that had made him feared on every road he had ever traveled. But in return, he had gained nothing but humiliation, and the worst part, Jason Steele had never even gotten angry, never lost his composure. He hadn't needed to beat Axel in a traditional sense. He had simply shown him the truth, that Axel wasn't as strong as he thought he was. Axel, and how deeply, his chest heavy. His gang still stood behind him, but he no longer felt their loyalty. They didn't speak, didn't laugh, didn't offer reassurance. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, and in their eyes, Axel saw something he had never seen before. Not admiration, not respect, doubt. If he stayed here any longer, it would only get worse. He had no choice. Axel dropped his head slightly, his jaw tightening. He had never done this before, never in his life, but now, he had no other option. Axel turned away, without a word, without a fight, without pride. He strode toward his Harley Davidson. No one stopped him. No one spoke. But he felt it. All eyes were on him. He swung his leg over the bike, took a slow, deep breath, then started the engine. Let's go. His voice was low. Defeated. No one in the gang argued. One by one, the motorcycles rumbled to life. Engines roared. But this time, there was no power in the sound. No confidence. Only the hollow thunder of men who had lost. Not a single person in town spoke. They just watched. Watched as the bikers disappeared down the winding road. As the final echo of engines faded into the distance, a collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. An older man stepped out of the cafe. His gaze settled on Jason, a look of quiet understanding. Then a slow nod. A silent thank you. Jason said nothing. He just nodded back. Then, he crouched down, running a hand gently over Milo's head. The golden retriever wagged its tail, as if it too understood that the storm had passed. The townspeople began speaking again. But this time, there was something different. They weren't whispering in fear. They were talking about Jason. A young boy tugged his mother's sleeve, eyes wide with excitement. Mom. That guy was so cool. His mother smiled, ruffling his hair. A man nearby exhaled, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. We've never seen anyone like him. No one called Jason a hero. No one hailed him as a savior, but every single one of them knew their town would never be the same again, and they would never forget his name. The energy in Hollow Creek slowly settled. People watched until the last biker vanished beyond the horizon. Then, for a long moment, silence, and finally, almost in unison, they all exhaled. The tension that had weighed on them all evening dissolved. Conversations returned. Faces softened, though no one said it out loud. They all knew. If Jason hadn't been here today, Their town might have faced its worst day yet. An old man near the cafe's entrance gave Jason a slow, knowing nod. A woman offered a small, grateful smile. A few men clapped each other on the back, as if they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Jason, as always, paid no mind to the attention. He simply crouched down once more, stroking Milo's fur. The golden retriever nudged into his touch, tail flicking contentedly. Beside them, Titten, silent, watchful, kept his gaze fixed on the road, as if making sure the threat was truly gone. Jason took a slow breath. Then he turned back toward the cafe. The glass door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. Inside, the patrons still hadn't quite shaken off their shock. But Jason didn't notice, didn't care. He walked back to his seat. His tea was still there. The steam had faded slightly, but it was still warm. He lifted the cup, took a sip. As if nothing had ever happened, the story that would never die in the days that followed. A story began to spread through Hollow Creek. A story about a man who never raised his voice, never acted aggressively, and yet made an entire biker gang leave in shame. They spoke of his calm eyes, his measured movements, the way he took down Axel with nothing but skill, not brute force, not anger, not rage, just precision. They told and retold the moment he stood there, without speaking, without fighting, without needing to prove anything, and somehow made Axel Vaughan understand that he had already lost, and most importantly, they repeated his words. "You kicked my dog. Now you know how that feels." A simple sentence, but one that carried a lesson Axel Vaughan would never forget. The children of Hollow Creek began to speak of Jason like a legend. They would gather at the cafe, point at his usual seat and whisper, "But was that where he sat? The man who beat the bikers?" The adults were no different. They spoke of that day as a turning point for their town. The day they realized that true strength didn't need violence, didn't need roaring engines, didn't need threats. The cafe owner, whenever a new customer arrived, would often nod toward the table by the window and say, "If to that was Jason Steele's seat. If you had been here that day, you would have seen something you'd never forget." But Jason didn't stay forever. One morning, just like any other, he stood up, left a few bills for his tea, and walked out. He knelt, running his fingers through Milo's for one last time, gave a small wave to the cafe owner. Then, he swung his leg over his bike and rode away. No one knew where he was going. No one asked. They just watched as his silhouette faded into the horizon. But even after he was gone, the town never forgot him, because from that day forward, Hollow Creek was no longer just another quiet place on the map. It had become a town with a story, a legend, and one day, when a traveler steps into the rusty mug, takes a seat by the window, and asks, "Is this where the stories in steel happened?" the cafe owner will smile, give a slow nod, and say, "Ah, yes. And if you'd like, I can tell you the whole story from the beginning."